Imagine standing in the middle of a desert where the sun burns the earth, the wind carries only dust, and water is nowhere to be seen. Yet, hidden beneath the ground, ancient Persian engineers discovered a way to make the desert bloom with gardens, flowing water, and cool air. They built tunnels that stretched for miles without collapsing, and towers that caught invisible winds and turned them into comfort. Tonight, we'll drift into that forgotten world to learn how something as simple as water channels and clay towers shaped civilizations, poetry, and the idea of paradise itself. By the end, you may find yourself wondering, if the ancients could tame the desert with silence and patience, what secrets might we still be overlooking today? Chapter 1. Awakening the Desert. How early Persians dug underground rivers. Imagine standing on the edge of a Persian desert at dawn, long before the sun begins to rise with its scorching weight. You would see an ocean of dust-colored land stretching endlessly, a silence so vast that even the soft shuffle of your sandals might feel too loud. To most, this landscape would appear hostile, a place meant for wandering caravans or forgotten bones. But to the engineers and gardeners of Persia, this was not a place of absence. It was a place of potential. The story of the Persian Qanats system begins with this paradox: how to create life where life should not exist. A Qanat, in its simplest definition, is an underground channel, a tunnel carved by hand through layers of soil and rock to tap into hidden aquifers deep beneath mountains or hills. It was a river brought into being by patience and calculation, a slow work of digging shafts into the earth at intervals, linking them together until at last, cool water flowed out into the desert plain. This idea may seem almost too simple, yet in the early centuries of its invention, no idea was more transformative for human settlement in Persia. Archaeologists trace the origins of Qanats to somewhere around the first millennium BCE, during the Achaemenid Empire, or possibly even earlier among Median tribes. The principle was this: where rain fell in the mountains, water seeped through cracks and was stored naturally in underground aquifers. On the surface, that water might never appear. The desert floor would remain cracked and barren, but beneath, a hidden reservoir waited. By carefully observing the land, the color of soils, the shape of vegetation, even the flight of birds at dawn, Persian surveyors learned to read the signs of water. Then began the work of men who carried picks and baskets, who dug vertical shafts down like beads on a string, and who connected these shafts with sloping tunnels until water began to flow. For you, listening now, it is easy to picture the system as a series of dots stretching across a desert plain, small, round holes, each one several meters wide, aligned in perfect formation like stitches across the land. These were the breathing points of the Qanat. They allowed diggers to haul soil to the surface, to descend with ropes and ladders, and most importantly, to let air circulate underground so men could continue their work without suffocating. The task was slow, sometimes taking years. Each meter of tunnel demanded exact slope, too steep, and the water would rush uncontrollably, eroding the channel. Too shallow, and the water would stagnate. The ideal gradient was no more than 1 meter of decline for every 1,000 meters of length. Imagine maintaining that calculation through miles of darkness with nothing but O-lamps, rope measures, and the human eye. By the time a Qanat emerged onto the plain, its water was already cool, shaded by layers of earth. This water did not evaporate under the sun's harsh gaze. Instead, it trickled into channels that fed villages, irrigated fields, or filled reservoirs where date palms and pomegranate trees could grow. The desert, once barren, could now sustain not only crops but entire cities. The Persians soon expanded. This principle, attaching Qanats to more than just farmland. Palaces, caravanserais, and temples were supplied by them. Even in the bustling streets of cities like Yazd, Kerman, or ancient Persepolis, hidden beneath the stones, these underground veins carried life quietly and invisibly. But the Qanat was only half of the story. To create true comfort in summer, to cool the air itself, the Persians developed the badger, or windcatcher. Yet before we reach those towers of breeze, it is worth pausing here. Consider again the men who dug. They were not architects, not kings, not poets whose names were carved into stone. They were workers, often peasants or enslaved laborers, who risked their lives in shafts that could collapse at any moment. Their sweat was not merely physical. It was the invisible cost of survival. For every flourishing garden above, there were dark tunnels below where torches burned and soil was lifted basket by basket. What is most remarkable, perhaps, is how ordinary this became. By the time of Darius the Great, Qanats were so widespread that entire provinces paid tribute in water drawn from them. Records even describe royal inspectors tasked with maintaining Qanats, ensuring that villages did not neglect their underground lifelines. Some Qanats once dug flowed for centuries without drying up. In fact, there are Qanats in Iran still in use today, more than 2,500 years after their first construction. When you think of Persia, you may imagine monumental palaces or the columns of Persepolis. Yet the true monument of Persia was beneath the ground, invisible, boring in its repetition, but astonishing in its endurance. And here, a quiet thought lingers. If life could be engineered in the desert by patience, calculation, and hidden effort, what other invisible systems once shaped the daily lives of civilizations? Chapter 2. Towers of Wind. Harnessing breezes to cool the palace and bazaar. Picture yourself standing in the heart of an ancient Persian city at midday. The sun, relentless and unblinking, presses down with a heat so dry that the very air feels brittle. Merchants call out from their shaded stalls, selling spices, dates, and bolts of woven cloth. But their voices rise into a silence that seems to swallow sound. The streets shimmer, their stones radiating heat, and then you step into a courtyard shaded by tall mud brick walls. A sudden coolness brushes across your face, not the manufactured chill of modern machines, but a soft, natural draft carrying with it the faint scent of water. You look up and see it, a tall tower rising above the roofline, its open slits facing the horizon in multiple directions. This is a badger, a windcatcher, the second half of the Persian genius for engineering comfort in an unforgiving landscape. The principle of the windcatcher, at its simplest. A badger is a tall chimney-like structure designed to capture wind and direct it downward into a building. But like the Qanat, its elegance lies in its precision. Persian architects understood that air, like water, can be guided by design. The windcatcher's openings were positioned to face prevailing breezes, and once air was caught, it traveled downward through vertical shafts. If the shaft connected to a room, the incoming wind cooled it directly. If it connected to a subterranean cistern or to a Qanat-fed reservoir, the wind was cooled even further as it passed over water before entering the living space. In this way, a palace hall or a merchant shop could be kept several degrees cooler than the scorching streets outside. Even in a city like Yazd, where summer temperatures still reach above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the interiors of windcatcher-equipped houses could remain tolerable. And the beauty of the system was its simplicity. It required no fuel, no fire, no costly resource beyond brick, mortar, and the labor to build. From desert homes to royal palaces, the badger became a standard feature of Persian architecture from around the first millennium CE, spreading through Islamic periods and across the Middle East. But its origin, like that of the Qanat, likely lay in simple domestic use. Farmers and merchants needed refuge from heat just as much as kings did. In time, however, windcatchers grew taller, more elaborate, and more symbolic. Palaces of the Safavid and Qajar dynasties in cities like Isfahan and Kashan were crowned with elegant badgers, their symmetrical towers rising like guardians of the breeze. In some cases, these towers were so finely constructed that they could draw air from even the slightest whisper of wind. The Badji Dolet Abad in Yazd, for instance, boasts one of the tallest surviving badgers, reaching 33 meters into the sky. Its shaft directs air down into a pavilion that overlooks a garden, combining coolness with aesthetic pleasure. But the use of badgers was not limited to the elite. Walk through a Persian bazaar in the medieval period, and you would find merchants selling silk under domed roofs, pierced by shafts that acted as smaller windcatchers. Caravanserais, roadside inns that sheltered travelers on the Silk Road, also relied on them. A weary merchant from India or a scholar from Samarkand could rest in relative comfort, cooled by a system that worked invisibly above them, engineering air like water to the Persian mind. Air and water were not separate elements, but companions. Where the Qanat carried cool water underground, the windcatcher guided cool air above ground. And where the two systems were combined, the effect was remarkable. Imagine a wealthy merchant's house in Yazd. Water flows from a Qanat into a stone cistern beneath the floor. Above, a tall windcatcher directs breezes downward. As the air passes over the cold surface of the stored water, it cools further before entering the rooms of the house. What you feel is not just a breeze, but a breeze softened and chilled by water drawn from deep beneath the earth. In some buildings, the airflow is carefully controlled with damp wooden screens or reed mats hung across interior openings. The air passed through these moist barriers, adding a further cooling effect. This principle is essentially the same as today's evaporative coolers, but it was being practiced centuries ago, long before electricity. The aesthetics of coolness. Persian architecture never separated function from beauty. The windcatcher, while practical, was also designed as a visual statement. Many were decorated with geometric brickwork, plaster carvings, or colorful tiles. Their tall, slender forms broke the flat horizon of desert cities, signaling the presence of comfort within. For Persians, coolness was not only a physical relief, but a cultural symbol. In poetry, gardens and breezes often symbolized paradise itself. To sit in a pavilion cooled by a windcatcher was not only to escape the desert's heat, but to feel a small reflection of cosmic harmony, the ordered balance of earth, water, air, and fire beyond Persia. The journey of the windcatcher, like the Qanat, the badger did not remain confined to Persia. The principle spread with trade and conquest. Variations can be found in the architecture of Egypt, where they are called mulkaf, and in the Gulf, where coral stone houses in Bahrain and Dubai still carry the outlines of windcatcher towers. Even in North Africa, echoes of the design appear, and yet, it is in Iran that the tradition has endured most strongly. The city of Yazd, recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, is often called the City of Windcatchers. To walk its old quarters is to walk through a living museum of these towers, each one quietly doing what it was designed to do, capturing wind, guiding it, cooling life against the odds of climate. The boring but astonishing detail. Here lies the deeper point, what seems like a dull architectural detail. A chimney on a mud brick house was in fact a survival mechanism on which entire urban centers depended. Without windcatchers, bazaars might have emptied at noon, palaces might have become unbearable, and homes might have required endless water just to keep cool. Instead, with towers of wind rising above them, Persian cities pulsed with life even under the most hostile of suns. And here we may pause with a question. If Persians could tame the desert with nothing more than air, brick, and patience, what does it tell us about the possibilities hidden in the most ordinary elements of nature? Chapter 3: The Silent Garden. Combining water and wind for paradise on earth. Imagine yourself walking at dusk through the gates of a Persian garden. Beyond the mud brick walls, the desert lies in silence, harsh and dry. But inside, everything changes. Narrow channels of water reflect the fading light, flowing in straight lines that divide the garden into perfect squares. Cypress trees rise like dark green columns, while the faint fragrance of jasmine hangs in the air. A soft breeze moves across your face, carrying with it coolness not found in the desert outside. The air is neither too heavy nor too thin, but balanced as if measured by unseen hands. This place is not accidental. It is the result of one of the most enduring cultural achievements of Persia, the Chahar Bagh, the four-part garden, where underground water and captured wind were woven together to create a vision of paradise on earth. The geometry of paradise, the Persian word for garden, paradisa, means walled enclosure, a term that later gave us the English word paradise. The design was based on order, dividing the garden into quadrants by water channels that met at a central pool or pavilion. The quadrants were not simply aesthetic. They reflected the cosmic order. To Persians, the fourfold design symbolized the four rivers of paradise described in ancient Zoroastrian and Islamic thought. Water flowing in measured lines was more than irrigation. It was a statement that human order could bring balance to nature's chaos. And yet, none of this would have been possible without the Qanat. Beneath the garden, unseen, stretched the underground veins of water, brought from distant hills. Fed into channels, fountains, and basins, the water gave life to the enclosed sanctuary. What might have been a lifeless courtyard of dust became an oasis of vines, roses, and fruit trees, the role of the windcatcher. But water alone could not create comfort. That is where the windcatcher joined the composition. Rising above the walls and pavilions, these towers guided cool air into shaded halls where visitors could sit and rest. In gardens like the Fin Garden in Kashan or Dolatabad in Yazd, the architecture of the windcatcher and the channels of the Qanat were not separate systems but parts of a single design. Air flowed over water to be cooled before entering a pavilion, creating a natural form of air conditioning. The effect was not dramatic, but subtle, a gentle shift from heat to relief, a softness that allowed conversation, poetry, and contemplation to unfold. The garden, in this sense, was not just about survival. It was about the creation of atmosphere, a microclimate of peace and reflection, a place for kings and ordinary life. Persian kings used gardens as symbols of power. Cyrus the Great, according to accounts, had gardens planted as early as the 6th century BCE, showcasing the empire's ability to bend the desert into fertility. Later dynasties built elaborate gardens alongside palaces, making them spaces of ceremony and governance as much as leisure. But gardens were not limited to the elite. In smaller towns, even modest homes tried to replicate the principle of the Chahar Bagh on a reduced scale, a small courtyard, a trickle of water, perhaps a single windcatcher directing air into a shaded room. For an ordinary family, the garden courtyard was a place of gathering, meals, and evening rest. It was where children played, where women spun thread, and where elders sat to tell stories. The garden as spiritual refuge beyond their practical and social uses, Persian gardens carried spiritual meaning. The garden represented not only paradise after death, but the possibility of paradise in life. To walk among flowing water and green trees in a desert land was to taste something beyond necessity, a reminder of divine generosity. Persian poets often wrote of gardens as metaphors for the human soul. The flowing water was wisdom, the cypress was steadfastness, the rose was fleeting beauty. Hafez, Sadi, and Rumi all drew upon garden imagery to speak of love, longing, and eternity. In this way, the combination of Qanat and windcatcher went beyond engineering. It shaped culture, art, and imagination. Silent engineers of civilization. When we step back, the achievement is staggering in its simplicity. A tunnel dug into a hillside, a shaft rising above a roofline. Together they allowed millions of people across centuries to survive, thrive, and even dream in places where nature seemed determined to deny them comfort. Unlike the grand monuments of empires, these systems were quiet. There were no triumphal inscriptions declaring the glory of their builders. Instead, the Qanat and windcatcher worked in silence, hidden beneath the ground or disguised as ornament on the skyline. Yet without them, much of Persian civilization would have been impossible. It is, perhaps, the perfect example of boring history. The details of airflow and irrigation that rarely make headlines, but which sustain cities, economies, and cultures, the echo into modern times. Today, many cannot still flow beneath Iranian cities, though many have dried or fallen into disrepair. Windcatchers, too, still stand, some restored, others crumbling. Engineers and environmental designers now look back to them with new respect, searching for sustainable methods of cooling in an age of energy crisis. In fact, the principle of the windcatcher has been reimagined in modern architecture, from universities in the Middle East to experimental eco-homes in Europe. The idea that one can cool a building without machines, using only the logic of wind and water, feels once again relevant. A question that lingers as you leave the garden and step back into the desert. You cannot help but wonder if ancient Persians, with no electricity and only the most basic of tools, could create paradise from dust. What might we achieve if we return to their patience, their precision, and their quiet respect for nature's balance? Perhaps the question is not only how they survived, but whether we have forgotten something essential in the rush to invent what we call modern. And that brings us to the end of tonight's quiet journey through history. I hope these stories helped slow your thoughts and bring you a little peace as you drift toward rest. If you enjoyed this and would like more calm, sleepy history, please consider supporting the channel. A simple like or subscribing to Quiet Boring Sleep helps me share more of these long, peaceful stories with you. Until next time, may your night be restful, your dreams soft, and your sleep untroubled. Good night.